Many years ago, my friend Jonas and I were hiking along the Appalachian Trail. We really wanted to do the whole thing, but I couldn't set aside the months that it would take, so we decided to do a smaller section. We had planned a week-long trip instead. Not much happened for the first few days, but by the fourth day, we were settling into the rhythm of things. Our packs were lighter since we had eaten some of the food we brought, and our legs had adjusted to the daily miles. We had brought our own camping gear, but there were ready-built shelters along the trail as well. For those who don't know, these shelters are like little cabins that anybody can use. You often meet interesting people there, but they aren't managed or anything like that. Just a cabin in the woods for everyone. We arrived at one of the trail shelters that afternoon, which was a relief because the sun was going down and we were ready to rest. That would save us a bit of time setting everything up, and after a long day on the trail, I was happy to take the break. When we got there, we met two guys named Dean and Eric, who were already set up in some of the bunks. It was getting dark, but we were still up for hanging out a while longer. After talking to them for a few minutes, it was pretty clear that they weren't very experienced. They had brought way too much stuff. Their backpacks were easily double the size of ours. I can only imagine how uncomfortable it must have been for them on the trail. Eric in particular looked uncomfortable being outdoors. He mentioned how the bugs were really bad that day, even though they were pretty average. We chatted for a bit, and it turned out this was their first time doing anything like this. Dean seemed a little more relaxed, but Eric was definitely struggling. He complained about the bugs and kept swatting at mosquitoes. We tried to help them out and give them a few tips, but there wasn't much we could do. One thing about the shelters is that mice are a pretty common issue. They come in at night looking for any scraps of food. Most hikers get used to it, but Eric wasn't handling the idea of mice well. He kept saying he didn't think he could sleep there with the thought of mice running around. Jonas and I didn't like them either, but we were used to it. The four of us hung out that evening, and they were actually pretty cool guys. We played some card games until it was late, and we joked around a bit. Eric was in a similar field of work to me, and we kind of bonded over that. Later that night, after everyone had settled into their sleeping bags, the inevitable happened. Eric was trying to get some rest when a mouse actually climbed onto his sleeping bag. He freaked out, jumped up, and started swearing. It wasn't surprising, but it definitely caught everyone's attention. He said he was done sleeping in the shelter and was going to set up his tent outside, even though it was already dark by then. Jonas and I tried to convince him that setting up a tent in the pitch-black woods was a bad idea. We told him it was safer in the shelter and that the mice were just part of the experience. But Eric wasn't hearing any of it. He grabbed his gear and went outside to pitch his tent anyway. Dean and I went out to help him set it up. They had a big lantern that was great for the occasion. I held it so the other two could set up the tent and see what they were doing. After about 20 minutes, we came back inside, leaving Eric out there by himself. I got back into my sleeping bag and tried to get some rest. By then I was really tired from the day, and we probably stayed up a little too late. I was asleep before I knew it. I wasn't out for long though. We all woke up to the sound of screaming from outside. It sounded like Eric. Jonas, Dean, and I grabbed our headlamps and bolted out of the shelter following the noise. It didn't take long to find him. Eric was in his tent, only about 50 feet away from the shelter, curled up inside. He was shaking and yelling that someone had attacked him. We looked around, but didn't see anyone. It was dark though, and our lights could only reach so far. Eric said that he was lying in his tent when someone slashed at him through the fabric. He said they ran off as soon as he screamed. None of us really believed him at first. It didn't make sense that there would be someone else out there, and why would he run off for a little bit of screaming? We thought maybe Eric was imagining things, but when I checked his tent, there was a large slash right through the fabric. If he was making it up, then he would have had to trash his own tent. That's a lot of trouble for a practical joke. Whether it was real or not, we walked him back to the shelter, where he finally calmed down enough to lie down again. We left the tent out there, and we were planning to take it down in the morning when the sun was up. Back in the shelter again, I finally managed to get a good night's rest. I slept surprisingly well considering the circumstances. We all woke up with the sunrise in the morning, but when I looked at Eric, it seemed like he hardly slept. I was still terrified from the night before, and I could see large dark bags under his eyes, as if he had been up all night. After everyone was up, we all went out to help him take down his tent. When we got to it, my heart almost skipped a beat. His tent was slashed up pretty badly. There were long cuts across the side that looked like they were made with a knife. We saw the single cut the night before, which admittedly was disturbing, but this was something else. There wasn't much left of his tent. It was completely shredded. That also meant that somebody must have come back afterwards to do that. It was creepy, and that meant that there was somebody out there watching us when we went out to help. We packed up what was left of his torn tent and got back to the shelter. Eric and Dean decided to head back to town that day. They weren't going to continue their hike after what happened, which made sense. Jonas and I continued on the trail, but for the rest of the trip, every time we passed someone, we felt a bit uneasy. Someone crazy was out there, and I am just glad that we didn't run into him again. This is a crazy experience that I had with one of my best friends whose name is Ken. We'd known each other since we were kids, but we didn't live in the same city anymore. This happened when we were in our late 20s, so we were both working full-time, and he had a family. I was still single. Ken and I went to the same college, and we were close all throughout, but after we graduated, I took a job in a city a few hours away, while he stayed in our hometown. Even though we kept in touch and got together a few times a year, it wasn't like before. One summer, we decided to do something different. He suggested that we check out some of the hiking trails in our state. We were not far from the Appalachian Trail, so that was the obvious choice. It is a pretty famous place, so it seemed weird that I had never been there in my nearly 30 years in the area. Neither of us really knew much about the outdoors, and to be honest, we weren't prepared. Ken was out of shape back then, you know, the typical dad bod thing. Although I was in better condition, I didn't have much experience either. We didn't plan on setting any records or doing anything too intense. It was more about spending time outdoors and catching up. After looking it up online, I got the basics: tents, sleeping bags, and just enough food to get by for a few days. We figured we'd pick up more supplies along the way. We didn't have any tight schedule, which suited both of us. On the first day, the weather was nice and the trail wasn't too difficult. We joked about how we were doing better than we expected, even though we stopped a lot for water and to catch our breath. Ken was handling it better than I thought since he was pretty heavy. We both worked office jobs and didn't work out regularly, but it wasn't the most intense hiking, so we were getting by. But by the second day, we were starting to feel it. Ken was struggling more than me, and we weren't covering as much ground as we had hoped. We weren't in a rush though, so we just kept moving at our own pace. I think both of us were glad to be away from work and everyday life for a bit, even if the hike was harder than we expected. The further we got, the more isolated it felt. We passed a few other hikers, but for the most part, it was just us. It was quiet and peaceful, which was exactly what we were looking for. While we were hiking on the third day, we came across a group of 3 guys. They looked more experienced than us. They had better gear and were faster. They really seemed to know their way around. They passed us, then went way ahead, but about an hour later, we came across them as they were having lunch. We struck up a conversation. They seemed cool and asked us where we were from and how long we planned to be out there. One of them mentioned that they had been on the trail several times before, which made sense given how comfortable they seemed. After a bit of talking, they started telling us about a route they knew that wasn't on the official map. They said it was a sort of secret trail, something only locals would know about. According to them, it was more scenic and would take us to a great spot where we could camp for the night. Ken and I looked at each other, not entirely sure if we should go off the main trail, but it sounded like a fun adventure. We had plenty of daylight left, and we were curious about what this hidden route might be like. We agreed to follow them, thinking that it couldn't be that far off the main trail. At first, the path they led us down was rough, but still visible. The terrain was a bit more difficult than what we were used to, but we managed to keep up. The further we went, though, the less it looked like a trail. After about half an hour, it was barely a path at all. Ken mentioned that maybe we should turn back, but the other guys insisted it wasn't much farther. We didn't want to seem like we couldn't handle it, so we kept going. We finally stopped, and then I realized that the trail was gone completely. We were in a small grassy clearing with trees all around. The other guys turned around, and that's when things took a bad turn. One of them took a step towards me and pulled out a knife. I thought he was joking at first, so I laughed and pushed his hand away. But when I did, he slashed at me with the blade, and it made a cut in my arm at the underside of my wrist. I looked down at the wound, and blood started to drip down my skin. Then I looked back up and saw the look in that guy's eyes. He was dead serious, and I was truly terrified. I couldn't believe what was happening. It was broad daylight, and we were in the middle of nowhere with no one else around. They took everything from us, our backpacks, food, sleeping bags, and even our shoes. Ken and I didn't argue or try to fight them off. It wasn't worth getting hurt over. After they had what they wanted, they disappeared back into the woods, leaving us there with nothing. We had no idea how to get back to the main trail, and without any gear or supplies, we were in serious trouble. The temperature was already starting to drop, and neither of us was dressed for a cold night. We started walking in what we thought was the right direction, but without a map or any landmarks, we were completely lost. We ended up spending the night out in the open, trying to stay warm with what little we had. It got so cold that we thought we might not make it. We didn't sleep at all. By morning, we were exhausted, freezing, and still lost. We got up and kept walking, though. We were hoping to run into someone or find a recognizable trail. After hours, we finally stumbled upon another group of hikers. They were shocked when they saw us and immediately offered help. They gave us some food and helped us find our way back to the main trail. We got out of that one alive, but those jerks were never found. We reported the whole thing, but they must have taken off while we were still lost. If nothing else, it was definitely an adventure, but not the kind that I would recommend. This happened in the summer of 2002. Me and some of my friends went out on a camping trip. We lived in New York, and all of us were city kids, but I had always wanted to check out the Appalachian Trail, so I convinced them to come with me. There were 4 of us in total: my roommate Derek, his twin brother Rick, and our other friend Cameron. We had planned on spending 2 weeks out there, and then we would call for a ride from however far we made it. It was summer vacation, and we all had a month without school or work, so it was kind of open-ended. If we wanted to, then we were open to calling it off early. We had been out there for a few days, and the exhaustion was starting to set in. The constant walking, the weight of our packs, and roughing it in the outdoors was wearing everyone down. I wasn't sleeping well, but I didn't want to quit. The days were long, and we didn't have much energy by the time we'd set up camp each night. My muscles ached, and it seemed like the sleepless nights dragged on forever. No matter how tired I felt, I just couldn't sleep right. Every little sound in the woods would wake me up, and my sleeping bag didn't seem to be warm enough. I would lie there tossing and turning, trying to pretend I was anywhere else. Still, I knew we were close to finishing this part of the trail, so I kept pushing myself. I think Cameron was feeling the same way, but we were all trying to be tough and not look weak. Nobody said it, but I think everyone was feeling run down. Even though I was exhausted, there was something about being out there that felt rewarding. We were experiencing the wilderness in a way we never had before, and despite the discomfort, it was worth it. One afternoon, we decided to take a break around midday. We had already been walking for hours, and the sun was high in the sky. Most of us were content to sit around and relax for a bit, but my friend Derek seemed to have more energy than the rest of us. While we were sitting around resting our feet and drinking water, Derek got up and wandered off to explore the area a bit. None of us thought much of it. He'd been like that the whole trip, always looking for something interesting to check out, while the rest of us tried to catch our breath. After a while, he came back and told us that he had found something. He didn't give many details, but he seemed pretty eager for us to see it. We'd had a good rest already, so we all stood up and followed him. He led us up a small hill just off the main trail. The climb wasn't too bad, but we were tired enough that it felt steeper than it probably was. When we got to the top, Derek pointed off into the distance. I squinted my eyes, trying to see what he was pointing at, but I didn't see it at first. Then he described it and pointed again. There, hanging from a tree branch in the distance, was something red or pink. At first we couldn't tell what it was, but it looked like a jacket, or maybe a sweater. It was odd seeing something like that out in the middle of nowhere. The trail was remote, and it wasn't common to see clothing just lying around. We started to worry that it might belong to someone who needed help, so we decided to go over and check it out. It was a fair distance away, probably close to 100 yards, maybe more. It was a rough walk too, because there was no trail leading there. It was all over sharp, jagged rocks, with thick bushes getting in the way as well. When we finally got to the spot, we found that it was indeed a red jacket hanging from a tree branch. The fabric was weathered and faded, like it had been out in the elements for a long time. It was really more like a pale pink, but you could tell that it used to be red. It was torn in a few places, and the colors had almost completely washed out. We all stood there for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. Derek walked up to get a closer look. but there wasn't much to see beyond the obvious wear and tear. As we started to look around the area, we found a few more things that made the situation stranger. Not far from the jacket, we came across an old water bottle. It was the kind you'd take hiking, but it was caked with dirt and had clearly been there for a while. A few steps beyond that, we spotted a pair of hiking boots. One of them was lying on its side, half buried in leaves, while the other was still upright. It looked like someone had taken them off and left them behind, but we knew that wasn't likely. Then we saw something that made us stop in our tracks. Near the boots, we found what looked like a bone. It was partially covered by the underbrush, but there was no mistaking what it was. I wanted to think that it belonged to a deer, but given what we found leading up to it, I couldn't help but feel that it was human. I am in no way qualified to tell the difference, and neither were any of my friends, so we didn't touch anything else. None of us wanted to stick around after that. We quickly backed away from the area and made our way back to the trail. Once we were back, we hiked out and reported what we found to the authorities. Later, we learned that the remains belonged to a hiker who had gone missing over a year ago. They had been searching for him for months, but the trail is vast, and it's easy to get lost out there. After that, we called an end to our trip because none of us was in the mood to keep going. Believe it or not, me and Derek went out the next summer and made it for a full 2 weeks. As disturbing as it was to find the site of some poor hiker's last day on the planet, we couldn't help but give it another try.